Hello everyone, this is a real-world review of the EOS R5. I had a 5D Mark III previously and then a 5D Mark IV, and when the local camera store told me that there was an R5 in stock, I jumped on the opportunity and bought it. They only had an R5 with the kit lens, which is an RF 24-100 f4 lens, and I was initially hesitant to buy a body plus a lens, but that's all they had, and so I got it. I paid over $5,000 for it, and I figured I would compare it to my existing 5D Mark IV with the 24-70mm f2.8 lens, which is a fantastic combination. The 5D Mark IV is built like a tank and has a certain heft to it. I remember when I got my R5, I thought the build quality was perhaps one step lower, but the more I used it, I think it's built just as well as the 5D Mark IV. The plastic has a more textured feel to it. There are lots of soft touch rubberized areas. The 5D Mark IV is a very ergonomic camera. I have all the buttons at easy reach from my fingers. The few buttons that are hard to reach are the ones on the left, the rate button, the magnify buttons, etc., and you have to use two hands to use them. The R5, I think, is exceptional as far as ergonomics are concerned. Now, all the buttons on the R5 are very easy to reach, and you can easily use the camera with one hand. For instance, the zoom button is very conveniently placed just where your thumb can reach it. The info button is just below it, and the Q button is recessed, and all of them can be accessed just by feel. Now, if you look at the delete button, it's a little recessed, and all of these buttons, even if it's at night, even if it's not illuminated, you can differentiate it by feel. I was a little concerned about not having a regular mode dial like my 5D, but the mode dial on this is much easier to use. You just press a button and you have all the options you need. Info button gets you to the video screen and you just touch what you need. You can move the focus points using the joystick at the back, but even more impressive is that if you have your eye to the viewfinder, you can use this area to move the focus points around very quickly, much quicker than using the joystick. I'll probably never shoot in 8K, but if I did, it tells me there's 15 minutes of shooting time left before it overheats. In 4K IPB, there's really no record limits at all. In 4K All-I, I do believe there is a record limit, but when I have shot in All-I versus IPB, I really have not found a difference in quality at all. So for me, there's no reason the camera should overheat at all. If you want to shoot in the 4K high quality mode, it is kind of hidden in the menu and you have to go into the menu system to find it. This is also where the high frame rate mode resides. This mode is sharper than the regular 4K, but you would never be bothered by it unless you're looking at it side by side. As you can see, the adapted EF lens is much louder than the native RF lens during video autofocus. This is the R5 with the native 24-105 IS lens. The camera does a pretty decent job of keeping the shot steady. Here I'm doing my very best to keep the 5D Mark IV as stable as possible, but even then the footage is extremely shaky. The 5D Mark IV on a gimbal on the bottom right appears to be the most stable. The R5 with the native 24-105 lens does pretty well as well, followed closely by the R5 with an adapted 24-70mm lens. Here in the top left corner, the R5 with the 24-105 lens is shown with electronic stabilization on. After looking at these shots on a big screen several times, The 8K is slightly better than the 4K fine, which is slightly better than the 4K, followed by the Full HD. However, the difference really is small. I truly think sharpness is overrated. Sharpness is hard to determine when you're shooting moving subjects, when the camera is panning, etc. I have never heard anyone say, hey, that movie's bad because it's not sharp. In fact, a lot of high-end productions insert a softening filter to make the picture softer and more cinematic. To my eye, the regular 4K on the R5 appears to be of better quality than the 4K on 5D Mark IV, with a much smaller and manageable file size. Here is the full HD version. Notice how the image stabilization on the R5 keeps the image so steady. So these two pictures are both taken with the R5 with the 24-105 RF lens. On the left is the electronic shutter and on the right is a mechanical shutter. I was surprised to find that the electronic shutter is actually sharper than the mechanical shutter. So if I zoom in here, you can actually see these lines much more clearer than on the mechanical shutter. And if you look at these numbers, they're also sharper compared to the mechanical shutter. I tried to repeat the test many times using different shutter speeds, using a weight on the tripod, etc. And the results were pretty much similar. So I think from now on, my default will be the electronic shutter unless I'm shooting very fast moving subjects or need a flash. Here on the left, you have the R5 with the 24-70mm f2.8 lens at an aperture of f4. This is a favorite lens of mine, and it produced great results on the 5D Mark IV. And on the right is the R5 with the native 24-105 f4 lens. Now both are at 70mm zoom, and if you notice on the right, the 24-105 at 70mm is slightly more zoomed in and therefore appears to have slightly more reach than the 24-70 on the left. Now if you zoom in, the 24-70 appears to be perhaps a little more contrasty, and both are equally sharp. If you look at the lines on the middle, both appear to be sharp, the numbers are sharp. But if you look closer, the 24-70 appears to be a touch sharper than the 24-105 lens. So here the 5D Mark IV with the 24-70mm lens at f4 is on the left, and the R5 with the 24-105 f4 is on the right. Now one thing I noticed right away when comparing the 5D Mark IV with the R5 was a difference in white balance. So if you look at the image on the right, it looks more yellower than the one on the left. Now if you zoom in, the lines in the middle on the R5 appear to be clearer than the one on the 5D Mark IV. That may be partly because of the resolution of the sensor and also because of the higher zoom range on the R5 lens. But if you look at the numbers, they are quite sharp on both, and so I don't necessarily think the sharpness is much different between the two cameras despite the difference in megapixels. One of the things I had noticed was a difference in white balance on the 5D Mark IV versus the R5. I wanted to make sure it was not because of the different lenses. So here the R5 has been adapted with the 24-70mm lens and compared with a native EF lens. You can see that the white balance looks about the same and the white sheet of paper looks a little yellowish under tungsten light. Here the 5D Mark IV is on the left and the R5 is on the right under similar lighting conditions and set to auto white balance. You can see that the 5D Mark IV appears to have a more correct auto white balance setting than the R5, and the R5 images look a little more yellowish. If someone else has noticed this, please let me know. Here is a comparison between the two bodies during daytime, and here the white balance seems to be more evenly matched. But even then, if you look at the 5D Mark IV on the left compared to the R5 on the right, there's very subtle changes in the color of the wall. I don't think this is much of an issue, and I have not noticed any difference in skin tones when shooting with the R5, and the white balance can obviously be changed in post if need be. These are some of the birds in flight pictures I've taken on the 5D Mark IV. While I've been successful in getting some pretty good pictures, I still had trouble when the birds were suddenly moving, such as when they were taking off or landing, and I was hoping to improve on the pictures because the focus system on the R5 is supposed to be better, and the 20 frames per second would be a bonus. Okay, so let me go over some of the most common and favorite settings I use when I shoot birds in flight. So typically I use either custom mode 1, 2, or 3, which I have customized for birds in flight. Usually I use custom mode 2. You can see that the shutter speed is set at 1 in 1600. Aperture is usually wide open depending on the lens. And the ISO is set to auto ISO. I also use compressed RAW plus JPEG. High-speed shooting is on. Autofocus mode is AI servo. And I usually use a single autofocus point. I have this camera set to back button focus. So this one here is set to focus on a single point. So let's say there's a bird sitting there, then I would use a single point to focus on the body. I can move the focus point using the joystick. If I'm looking through the viewfinder, I can use this area to move the autofocus points much quicker, much faster than I can using the joystick or on the 5D Mark IV. Now if the bird is sitting, what I do is I have another button, the star button, assigned for eye autofocus. So if I press on it, if it detects an eye, it'll jump to the eye 90% of the time. The advantage of this is if a bird is sitting and I have it on eye autofocus, it'll focus on the eye 90% of the time. But if it doesn't detect the eye, it'll focus somewhere on the bird, usually on the head. And if it starts to fly, it'll still track the bird. If it doesn't see the eye, it'll track the head or the body. So I'll get somewhere on the bird that's in focus, and I can usually get the whole bird in focus provided I have a sufficient depth of field. Now, if for some reason these two buttons don't keep it in focus, I have the depth of preview button set to recall a zone autofocus. I can also do a different zone. For instance, I can do the horizontal zone, and I can have this recalled using the depth of preview button. This is very useful when a bird is in flight. The custom modes in this camera are really great. You can pretty much register any setting in the menu to custom mode 1, 2, or 3. So in this one, the shutter mode is electronic. If I go to a different mode, it might be mechanical. And then on one of them, it might be eye autofocus, animal, and on the other one, it might be eye autofocus human. So there's an infinite number of combinations that you can configure to the custom modes. I also have the computer automatically update the settings each time I shoot. For instance, now I'm shooting at 1 in 2000, and the f-stop is 4, and the ISO is an auto. So what the camera will do is it'll remember these settings. So if I go to a different mode and then I come back to the other mode, it'll recall the settings. I find that particularly useful, so I don't have to keep changing the settings when I change mode. And the way to do that is to go to auto update under custom settings. So no matter what camera you're using, it's very important to be able to access three things: the shutter speed, aperture, and the ISO as quickly as you can, because you're going to be changing those very quickly in the field. So I have my aperture right here in this wheel. The shutter speed is in this dial, so easy access, and the ISO I have is set, so I press the set button and the dial, and I find that the easiest way to change it. So I have all of these under EC axis, and then the ring button, I have set it to change white balance. So it becomes very easy in the field to change all of these settings. Let me see if this camera will detect the eye of this bird on my computer. So here you can see me trying to focus on the body of the bird using a single point, or on the head for that matter. And when I click on the star button, it goes from single point to detecting the eye. So, and that happens very quickly. Last weekend I was at a local lake trying to take some pictures and found this egret. So here I'm trying to keep the bird in focus, alternating between single point and eye autofocus, and finally I left it on eye autofocus because it was doing a good job. And suddenly the bird dives down and then comes back up with a fish between its bills. And then it shakes the water off, and I still have it focused on the eye, and all of a sudden it takes off. And I would never have been able to get the shot with the 5D Mark IV. And now I get a few shots of it flying off. All of those shots are in perfect focus. The R5 has a new feature called focus stacking, where you can take a number of pictures at slightly different focal lengths, and then you can use a free software such as Serene Stack or Photoshop to stack them together. And to finish it off, here are a couple of my macro shots. So in conclusion, I think this is an all-around fantastic camera. The autofocus is definitely better than the 5D Mark IV. The dynamic range is better. It's a better camera for video with smaller file size for 4K compared to the 5D Mark IV. There's full viewfinder coverage with autofocus areas, and there's no need to focus and then recompose due to the excellent eye autofocus. The shooting experience is faster and better, and I feel like using the camera all the time. Overheating really is a non-issue for me, as I still shoot mostly in 1080p or regular 4K, and to my eye I can't really tell much of a difference. The battery life is somewhat similar to 5D Mark IV in regular use. Now I do remember when I went from the 5D Mark III to 5D Mark IV, I thought the battery life took a significant hit, but going from the 5D Mark IV to the R5, I don't think it's much of a difference. The electronic viewfinder helps nail the exposure every single time for me. Now the electronic shutter at 20 frames per second is perfect for birds in flight, and I have not noticed any rolling shutter effects so far. Some reviewers have mentioned a lag in the viewfinder, and I have not noticed any such lag, especially in the electronic shutter mode. And I really do not miss the optical viewfinder in my 5D Mark IV. In fact, after a week of using the R5, when I go back to the 5D Mark IV, I feel like I'm picking up a dinosaur. The body is now too heavy for me, the shutter is too loud and clunky, the autofocus points are a pain to move around with the joystick, especially since there's no full screen coverage. This leads me to focus and recompose all the time. In fact, I'm so used to the R5, and I do feel that the R5 is a worthy upgrade over the 5D Mark IV. That was a pretty long review, and if you've gone this far, I hope you can hit the like button and subscribe. And please let me know if there's anything else you want me to test out on the new R5.